Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to do a walkthrough of a practice exam for exam 2 in Principles of Micro. So this exam covers government intervention, so taxes, price controls, covers welfare, so an exchange, so gains from trade, so consumer and producer surplus. I actually like to approach that more from the context of analyzing what happens with price controls like minimum wage, price ceilings, taxes. But anyhow, that's on the exam as well. Comparative advantage, absolute advantage, exchange, labor markets, like specifically thinking about the labor market and things that can shift labor demand and labor supply. And then externalities, positive and negative externalities. And those topics are reflected here. This was indeed, I say it was a practice exam, this was indeed a past exam. The exam that I'll have for the for the 2021 term will have like equal representation, approximately equal representation across the chapters covered. But anyway, this is still a really good practice exam walkthrough to go through. Now I've had this for a bunch of frames. You can see the questions. I'll do the same for the remaining questions. There are 25 questions on this exam. I like having the exams probably somewhere in the range of like 24 to 30 questions. Part of it is like with 6 chapters, I like to have like nice kind of whole number point values for the questions, but that's sometimes that's a trade-off I'm willing to make, is having like fractional point values. But anyway, so here are the questions. This one has graphs for the Canvas-based version of the exam. I won't have any graphs where you're going to see them and then have to interpret them. Instead, if anything, I would be referencing a graph, or I'd invite you to build a graph on your own or something like that. Reason why this works really well for a practice exam. I actually gave this exam for the smaller section of the class, and so then it wasn't such a worry. But with Canvas, there's always issues of like, does a table display? Like, are you actually able to see the table or the graph? And so I don't like having that during a live exam that's administered other than in the ordinary classroom setting, because if there's technical difficulties, like even though I try to be as kind of reasonable as possible, kind of addressing those, still that just creates such unnecessary anxiety for students. And so there won't be any like graphs that are like interpret this graph or refer to figure 1 or whatever. No, I won't have anything like that. Okay, so here's the solution set. I actually wrote this so that row 1 is page 1, row 2 is page 2, row 3 is page 3, and so on and so forth. That's actually just like how I like doing it, because if I have a small section, I actually just write out the key like this. I memorize the key and then I grade page by page. So I actually don't like sending the exam to the using Scantrons and sending it to the machine. Sometimes there's mistakes. Not usually. It's usually about 99% accurate, but sometimes there's some situations. And then also I like to see what you're drawing in the margins, because I think that actually, even if that's not super relevant for the scoring of the exam, that's really important for me, like as faculty, thinking about what was your thought process answering this question. And that's helpful for me making the course more effective. But that's, again, so in the sort of unusual current environment we've got, it's not possible. So anyway, let me go over each of these exercises or each of these exam questions. So for a lot of them, I'm just going to kind of talk about them. For some of them, I'll go to the supporting sheet of graphs and figures that I've drawn out. And so I'll do that where appropriate. All right, so we have a character walking along the road, getting to work, and in doing so, breathing in fumes from cars. So arriving at work coughing. The economic term for the impact of cars on our character is externality, right? So for an externality, we have to have some primary activity. That's whatever is generating some central activity we're interested in, usually some type of market output or some other type of transaction. Then we've got to have bystanders. And since we've got our character here, we do have a bystander, and we're assuming this is actually negative externality, arriving at work coughing. Externalities is a little bit like the old adage, like if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? It's like that with externalities. However pernicious is the activity, if you don't have a bystander, there's no externality. You've got to have bystanders for there to be an externality. Okay, so if you have absolute advantage in producing a product, then you're the most efficient producer, right? You're able to produce using the fewest inputs, right? B, produce at the lowest opportunity cost. That's actually comparative advantage. And then the others are not actually relevant for what we're developing. Price floor. A price floor is a legal minimum that the good can be traded at within the market. So it's a mandated, like it's a legal minimum. So it's the minimum price the seller can charge in the market. So the price floor, you want to think of floors as like the floor in the room you're in, right? So you can't go through the floor. You don't have to be at the floor. You can jump, you can defy gravity or whatever. I don't know, jetpack or something. You can be anywhere in the room, stand on, desk or whatever is the case. You just can't go through the floor. And that's the idea with a price floor, which is like the price can be anything higher than the price floor. Matter of fact, if the equilibrium price is above the price floor, then the price floor is irrelevant. We'd say it'd be non-binding. It's only binding if the price floor actually imposes a change in behavior on market participants. And for that to happen, the price floor would have to be higher than the equilibrium price, not allowing you to go down to the equilibrium. Okay, so which of the following is caused by a subsidy for buyers of a particular item? Now, for a subsidy, you want to think of this as the complementary idea would be like a tax on buyers. Think about like the statutory burden of a tax. So a statutory burden of a tax on buyers we would model as a leftward shift of the demand curve. For a statutory burden, so to speak, or benefit of the subsidy on buyers, we'd model this as a rightward shift. So the benefit inclusive demand curve would be further to the right. So it's not one leftward shift of the demand curve. We're going to get an increase in the quantity sold. That happens with a rightward shift of demand. And 3, that gives us a rightward shift of demand. Okay. The U.S. has a comparative advantage in high-skilled labor. This explains why the U.S. is a net importer of manufactured goods, right? So what you end up doing is whatever you have a comparative advantage in, you should produce that thing and then you should trade for everything else. And so high-skilled labor actually we assume would spend more time producing like services and so on and so forth. But also actually the U.S. is a major producer of like really big type manufactured things like washing machines, refrigerators, jet engines, boats, boat engines, cargo ships, stuff like this. Okay, so across demographic groups in the U.S. population, poverty rate varies by race, ethnicity, family structure, and employment. Substantially so, right? And this is really important for policymakers to pay attention to. Okay, so Katie is faster than her husband Brett at putting up a tent and starting a fire. Who should take care of these tasks on their camping trip if they want to maximize their time sitting around the campfire? Let's see, much faster putting up the tent and starting a fire. So who should take care of these tasks? Well, we're assuming, this actually says something about being much faster. Think about what I was talking about a second ago with comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Where did I do the absolute advantage? You can produce the product using the fewest inputs. What we're actually told about Katie is that their comparative advantage, their ability to put up the fire faster says something about efficiency. So we know Katie probably has absolute advantage in producing and setting up putting up the tent, and starting the fire. Actually has absolute advantage in both. Katie's just way better than Brett at both. Still, that doesn't tell us who the tasks should be assigned to. To know something about who the tasks should be assigned to, we want to know what you're comparatively better at, in the sense of having the lowest opportunity cost. So indeed, the correct answer is they each have a comparative advantage in a particular task. They should focus on doing that. Katie can help Brett when they finish their task. Katie should. So that's the right answer. So whatever ends up being Katie's task, it's going to be whichever one Katie has the lowest opportunity cost of producing. They should complete both tasks together, sharing all the work. No, that's super inefficient. Though that might be, maybe that's beneficial for the relationship. Who knows? Or not. So Katie should complete both tasks because Kate is most efficient worker. This is absolute advantage. Brett could watch and learn from Katie, probably, yeah, but that's not gonna maximize time sitting around the campfire, right? Katie should be in charge, directing the work while Brett does it. Again, not gonna maximize the time sitting around the campfire, unless Katie, wait a second. So this is, don't put this on your exam because you'd get it wrong. What if Katie starts the fire and then sits at the campfire watching Brett put up the tent, right? So then we'd have a situation where Katie would be able to maximize Katie's time sitting around the campfire, right? And then it would be D. But no, as always, the best answer is just what you want to select, and that's A here. Main role of markets is, let's see, reallocating resources to better uses. That's the idea. So efficiency is achieved at the competitive equilibrium, and the idea is then goods go to those buyers who value them most highly and are produced by the sellers who can do it at the lowest cost. And in doing so, we're reallocating resources to better uses. It's not facilitating consumption, though that's ancillary, not preventing waste in choices, not providing jobs and products, though that is ancillary. The other thing, though, is what I just said about efficiency that is on the assumption. Remember from the text, the Kim Kardashian criticism, that is on the assumption that willingness to pay is a really good proxy for ability to pay, right? Because the market's going to send the goods to whoever has the highest willingness to pay. And we're assuming, and we got to check our assumptions if it ends up not holding, because it can lead to distributional and inequality consequences. But if we have problems, right? If willingness to pay and ability to pay are decoupled. I discussed that in the ethics of economics, ethics and economic behavior course I teach. That's not what we're talking about for this particular question. Here we're just saying, okay, other things equal, what's the role of markets? Well, it's reallocating resources to better uses. Which is a source of comparative advantage? Oh, well, highly specialized skills. It's not small-scale production. Remember, comparative advantage has to do with lowest opportunity cost, not scarce inputs. That would have something to do with absolute advantage, potentially, but in a really indirect way. High tariff rates? No, that's ridiculous. All right, so it's specialized skills is a source of comparative advantage because that allow you to produce something at a lower opportunity cost than others. A binding price floor. So I was mentioning this before with price controls. A binding price floor would be a price floor set above the equilibrium price. Above the equilibrium price, it's going to strike the demand curve first. So the quantity demanded is going to be smaller than where it strikes the supply curve, where the quantity supplied is. If quantity supplied is bigger than quantity demanded, we have a surplus. The statutory burden of a tax is irrelevant for tax incidence. Statutory burden of the tax just says who's transmitting the payment to the government, right? So it's not determines who finally pays the entire tax being levied. It just determines like who's actually sending who's sending the money to the government. Always leads to an equal allocation of the tax between buyers and sellers? No. When does that happen? If demand and supply have the same slope, which is a good proxy for their elasticity. Remember, it's whichever side of the market is more inelastic. If demand is more inelastic, then it's less responsive to the price change caused by the tax. Buyers just, on average, pay the tax and therefore bear the burden of the tax. If demand is less elastic than supply, more elastic than supply, so we have a bigger elasticity, more responsive. Why was what I said before wrong? Less elastic is more inelastic, which I just said. Okay, so if demand is more elastic than supply, it's more responsive. Buyers are going to try to avoid the tax. That would be like bottled water. If there's a particular tax assessed on a single bottled water producer, but not all the others, we just buy the other bottled water producer because they're essentially the same. You've got a lot of other substitutes. And so basically, tax incidence is striking those with fewer alternatives, fewer substitutes to just paying the tax or just incurring the tax. Doesn't play a role in determining where demand and supply shifts as a result of the tax. No, the statutory burden of the tax tells us, like, is supply or demand, which one we model is shifting. But yeah, when we're talking about tax incidence, we're talking about not the statutory burden, we're talking about the economic burden. Actually, just looking at this graph, here we've got a tax on sellers of soft drinks. So this would model the statutory burden being on sellers of soft drinks, but not necessarily the tax burden on sellers of soft drinks. In this case, the tax burden to sellers is somewhere in the range of like half of what the tax is. So, okay, so we want to think carefully about what's going on here. I'll get to that in a second. I want to kind of work through this question. In this graph, the original equilibrium price is $2.50. A tax is placed on the sellers of soft drinks. What's the amount of the tax? Well, remember, the tax wedge, the difference between the price paid by buyers and price received by sellers, is going to be the amount of the tax. And a good way to find that is just to go out and find where the supply curve and the demand curve is the size of the tax away from each other. Now, I'm okay with this question in this particular context because this is zeroing us in on this quantity of 1 and calling our attention to $3 and $2. We probably need a little bit more information to tell us specifically we're looking at this quantity and this is the price paid by buyers, $3, and this is the price received by sellers. If we knew all that information, I think it's reasonable to infer from this graph. Then we'd say, oh, we want to look to find the difference, the vertical height of the supply curve. Remember, the theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. And the vertical height of the supply curve here, theory of supply, is the theory of marginal cost. Wait a second. The marginal cost to produce 1 unit, that should be the same. In both cases, these supply curves are at different heights. Oh, what must be going on is we've got this additional artificial marginal cost, which we'll call tax, right? All right, so that's this distance right here. This vertical height is $1. So this tax is going to be $1. The other way that I'd say this is if I was having you build a graph yourself, I'd say, all right, the equilibrium price on soda is $2.50. There's $1 per bottle tax. What's the new price paid by buyers? What's the new price paid by sellers? And what's the new quantity? And then I'd have you go to the graph. And if I told you the tax was $1, then you just go and find where the demand curve right here crosses the tax inclusive supply at a point exactly $1 higher than the old supply, right? So I'd have you do that. We can, anyway, so the last thing I wanted to say is in terms of tax incidence, we have approximately the same slope of demand and supply, meaning that the tax burden should be split between the two. Right? Probably the same elasticity. Actually, I know that's the case from looking at these numbers here. And what's going on is, hey, look, the equilibrium price of the tax or of the bottle is $2.50. The tax is $1. You might think that the equilibrium price would rise to $3.50. That's not what happens. Remember, we have this kind of change in the price, and so we're going to walk back on the demand curve. Right? By the law of demand, we're going to get a smaller quantity at a higher price. And so the quantity actually transacted upon is just going to be this 1, and then the associated willingness to pay for that 1 unit was $3. The cost to produce that 1 unit was $2. The difference between the willingness to pay for 1 unit and the cost to produce 1 unit is that $1. $3 minus $2, which is the tax, the $1 tax. Of that $1, this is the tax revenue rectangle. Right? This box right here is the tax revenue rectangle. The top half of it, it is exactly half, is the amount of the tax revenue that's generated from buyers, right? 50 cents right here over that 1 unit. And then this is the amount of tax revenue generated by sellers, 50 cents over that 1 unit. So actually in this exercise, this one right here, buyers and sellers are evenly bearing the burden, the economic burden of this tax, despite the fact that this is modeled as the statutory burden being on sellers. All right, market for pesticides. In the market for pesticides here, the original equilibrium price is $25. In order to reduce the usage of pesticides, a tax is then placed on buyers in the market. Who bears the statutory burden of the tax? Wait a second. I said I must have. I hope I didn't mess that up at the very top. Where did I make my mistake? Yeah, B. I just highlighted the wrong thing, so it says B right here. Yeah, that's ridiculous. It's not the government. The government's going to benefit from it. I'll have to change that in the file. Let me actually take a screenshot of myself. Then I'll see this like random screenshot on my desktop, and that'll remind me to fix this. It's not the government. It's the buyer, right? So this is going to be. It's actually going to be the buyer. We know that because the tax is on taxes on buyers. What this actually would be is a situation where we have a negative externality that we're trying to get the decision makers to internalize. So the idea would be we've got this negative externality generated by the use of pesticides. It's really hard for buyers to determine what's the environmental consequences of the pesticides they're putting on their lawn, for instance, especially in the aggregate. And so since it's difficult to quantify and it's not salient, government might come up with a way to bring forward those costs and to make it a little bit more salient to the consumer by adding this tax. And so now the idea is the consumers are going to reduce their quantity of pesticides used in response to this tax that they're now paying. The size of the tax would be right here. So this tax, so 27 would be the amount leaving the buyer's wallet. The amount that's going to stay with sellers is this 19, and the difference between 27 and 19 is the size of the tax, right? Also, relative to what I was just saying before, look at this little sliver at the top. That's the share of the tax that's going to be borne by buyers, and this is the share of the tax that's going to be borne by sellers, right? Okay. Which of the following is the amount of a corrective tax that would resolve a negative externality problem? Which is the amount of a corrective tax? The marginal external cost is what we're calling the additional harm that's befalling bystanders, right? The amount of the corrective tax that would fully resolve a negative externality problem is if you'd set the tax equal to exactly the additional incremental marginal cost that your activity is befalling on bystanders. Now, it's not the marginal social cost. It's not the total social cost. It's not the total external cost. It's the marginal external cost that's being generated. Why is it not the marginal social cost? Well, the marginal social cost is actually inclusive of the marginal external cost and the marginal private cost, right? Society is composed of the decision makers plus bystanders. Which of the following is an example of a negative externality? So we've got a truck at the grocery store. People in cars on each side have a hard time opening their car doors. Yeah, so that'd be a negative externality because those individuals are bystanders relative to the decision to park the truck. Let's see. Company has a decrease in profit where demand for its product falls. Nope. Remember from the text, price changes aren't externalities. Let's see. Needs new clothes. Nope. That's a direct effect. And then direct effect. Okay, fine. So the idea is with externalities, we want to draw a distinction between bystanders who are being affected versus yourself being affected. So the example would be smoking, right? So active smoking creates benefits, creates harms. Some of those harms are in the form of externalities like secondhand smoke. Again, you need to have bystanders actually there for there to be an externality. Although on most exams, probably we kind of make that assumption that there are bystanders who just assume that secondhand smoke is always and everywhere a negative externality. Technically, it requires a bystander. Anyway, but then there's health effects as a result of smoking. Those are not externalities. Those are unintended consequences, possibly, or maybe the person's making a risk calculation. However, those are direct harms to the individual themselves, and if it affects the original decision maker, it's not an externality. Okay, so we want to capitalize on comparative advantage. You should do more of what you're relatively good at and trade for the other things. That's exactly our application of comparative advantage. Okay, so here's one that requires a little bit more development. We've got two people in the economy, Justin and Ron. There's two different types of goods that can be produced, apples and Vegemite. Suppose both Justin and Ron work 120 hours per month. It takes Justin 12 hours to produce an apple, 3 hours to produce a jar of Vegemite. Ron takes 20 hours to produce an apple, 10 hours to produce a jar of Vegemite. If they're both allowed to specialize in trade, but both end up consuming 5 apples per month or between them 10 apples, what's the amount of Vegemite they could collectively consume, maximum amount? Okay, so here's my work. I got 120 hours available. Justin can produce 10 apples or 40 Vegemite in 120 hours. I'm going to divide through by 10. Justin can produce 1 apple or 4 Vegemite. That's Justin's opportunity cost of producing apples is 4 Vegemite, or a quarter of an apple and 1 Vegemite. Ron produces 6 apples or 12 Vegemite in 120 hours, 1 apple or 2 Vegemite, or 1/2 apple or 1 Vegemite. So Ron holds a comparative advantage in apples, Justin in Vegemite. So if they specialize and generate 10 apples, though, we have a problem. Comparative advantage has Justin specializing in Vegemite, Ron specializing in apples. Ron's only going to get us 6 apples. So we need Justin to contribute 4 apples. That's going to come at the cost of 4 Vegemite per apple, so we're going to lose 16 Vegemite from Justin. So our maximal amount of Vegemite is going to be 40 minus 16 is 24 Vegemite in order to jointly produce 10 apples total, right? And that's what's going on here. That's why it's 24 units of Vegemite is the most Vegemite we could consume, because we lost the maximal amount of 40 that Justin could have gotten by specializing, because we required Justin's abilities to produce apples. Okay, outcomes efficient if at the current level of output, the marginal cost of the last unit produced is equal to the marginal benefit of consumers. That's just definition of efficiency, right? So this is our competitive equilibrium occurs where demand crosses supply. The theory of demand is the theory of marginal benefit. The theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. So if quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, that's happening where marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. Okay. Suppose prior to allowing trade to occur, the domestic price of tomatoes in Mexico was below the world price. Domestic price of tomatoes in the U.S. was above the world price. Oh, if it's below the world price, Mexico has a comparative advantage in tomatoes. If it's above the world price, the U.S. lacks a comparative advantage in tomatoes. Mexico should export. The U.S. should import. As a result of allowing trade, therefore, U.S. producers are worse off when there's imports. The domestic producers are worse off. The U.S. consumers are better off. Mexican consumers are worse off because their tomatoes are being bypassed in the trade of tomatoes for U.S. consumers, and employment in the U.S. tomato industry will decline. That follows complementary with this first part, right? And here was my thoughts on it. So we have this graph. Here's the price of tomatoes in Mexico. It's right here. Here's the world price. Mexico should export. They are going to export, and this is good for Mexican producers because this right here, this triangle is going to correspond to the welfare gains from exports. They're going to find consumers in the U.S. who are willing to pay more than the consumers in Mexico. And so the foreign consumers of Mexico's tomatoes benefit. This is bad for U.S. producers because U.S. consumers are going to find foreign producers who are going to be willing to sell at a lower price. It's good for U.S. consumers, bad for Mexico's consumers. And that's true in general of free trade, import and export situations. Doesn't have to be tomatoes, it could be any product. All right, so in a given period of time, using the same number of resources, we have the following production possibilities for Mexico and Guatemala. So prior to trading, they're producing at this collection, right, in bold. Then they specialize according to comparative advantage. After specialization, the increase in banana production will be. Okay, so one thing you can do to just identify who ought to specialize in what is we see if Mexico specializes in oranges, we've got 200, 0 bananas. If Mexico specializes in bananas, we've got 200, 0 oranges, which means they give up 1 for 1. What about Guatemala? Well, we could get 50 oranges or 0 bananas, or 100 bananas or 0 oranges. Guatemala is giving up way more bananas to make oranges than is Mexico. So let's see. Mexico is able to produce 200 oranges or 0 bananas, or 0 oranges or 200 bananas. That's 1 to 1. So Mexico's opportunity cost of 1 orange is 1 banana. 1 banana is 1 orange. What about Guatemala? 50 oranges and 0 bananas, or 0 oranges and 100 bananas. That's 2 bananas for every orange for Guatemala, or 1 orange or 2 bananas, 1/2 of an orange or 1 banana. These are just opportunity costs, 1 banana or 1 orange. I said that backwards. 1 orange or 1 banana, 1 banana, 1 orange. Anyway, so what we're going to look at is who has the lowest opportunity cost in that particular good. Well, Mexico's opportunity cost of oranges is 1 banana. Guatemala's opportunity cost of oranges is 2 bananas, double. So Guatemala has a comparative advantage in bananas, and Mexico has a comparative advantage in oranges by virtue of giving up fewer bananas to make an orange. All right, so specialization involves having Mexico make oranges, we get 200. Guatemala making bananas, we get 100. This is an increase of 100 minus 40 minus 20, or total of an increase of 40 bananas, because this specialization outcome where we have 100 bananas is going to be measured relative to the situation where Mexico is making 40 and Guatemala is making 20. So 100 minus 40 minus 20 is 40 bananas. That's the increase in total banana production relative to what we are taking to be our starting situation. All right, so what would happen to the equilibrium hourly wage and equilibrium quantity employed in a particular industry if the following events occurred? So advances in production technology have increased the marginal productivity of workers. That's going to be a rightward shift of labor demand. and government increases the amount of unemployment benefits available to workers. That's going to be a leftward shift of labor supply. So we're expecting hourly wage is going to rise due to the increase in labor demand and decrease in labor supply. The impact on equilibrium quantity is unknown. Depends if demand shifts further than supply or supply shifts further than demand. So we have an increase in marginal productivity. This is going to increase the labor demand. Remember, labor demand is derived. It's depending on the market price as well as the productivity. This gives us our marginal revenue product. And then unemployment benefits, this is going to increase the opportunity cost of working, and so we'll get a decrease in labor supply. So both the effects, the graphs above, are a recipe for wage increases, and quantity rises if demand shifts more. That'd be this picture. I erased the supply curve, sorry. And then falls if supply shifts more. You can kind of visualize what would happen with the demand curve. Anyway, so let me cue this up for question 25. All right, so which of the following are true about positive consumption externalities? Let's see. Marginal social benefit exceeds marginal private benefit, and the equilibrium quantity exceeds the socially optimal quantity. Marginal social benefit exceeds marginal private benefit. Equilibrium quantity exceeds the social optimal quantity. No, because the problem with positive consumption externalities is we get underproduction. So marginal social benefit is less than marginal private benefit, and the equilibrium quantity exceeds. Nope, the equilibrium quantity is not going to exceed the socially optimal quantity with positive externalities. Marginal social benefit exceeds marginal private benefit, and the equilibrium quantity is less than the socially optimal quantity. That's right. We get less than what we'd want because the decision makers aren't taking into consideration the additional benefit to others, to bystanders. And so the true social benefit lies rightward of the private benefit curve. And so we draw a positive externality as like a rightward shift to the demand curve with a higher socially efficient quantity. That would be like where the marginal social benefit curve, the demand curve inclusive of the externality, would cross the private cost curve at a higher quantity than we would get in the free market equilibrium. And then the rest are similar. Okay, so suppose we observe a decrease in hourly wage and a decrease in employment of fast food workers. Which of the following could explain this outcome? So we want to see wages falling and we want to see quantity falling. That is going to require wages falling, quantity falling. That's going to require a decrease in labor demand. Let's see, people decide to do more home cooking, which reduces demand for meals, and therefore demand for workers producing those meals. That's a leftward shift. That's a decrease in labor demand. So we're expecting this one to be part of any correct answer. Automated ordering systems are less expensive, and the substitution effect dominates the scale effect. So this is going to mean it's going to be easier to automate. The substitution effect is where technology replaces workers. The scale effect is where technology basically enhances the value of hiring more workers, so producing output on a larger scale. So it's basically, is technology a complement or a substitute for labor? So if we see substitution effect being bigger than essentially the complements effect, this means that automation is going to replace workers. So this is a decrease overall in labor demand. Xbox and PlayStation, Xbox X and PlayStation 5 hit the market, caused a significant increase in the value placed on leisure amongst that. Not now, because nobody can get these things because they're sold out, and sold out since like October. Anyway, so hit the market, caused significant increase in value. This would cause a leftward shift in labor supply, right? That tend towards an increase in wage, though a decrease in quantity. Government increases minimum wage, more than doubles the minimum wage. That would decrease the labor demand. Okay, so the answer is going to be 1, 2, and 4 only, because this one causes a reduction in labor supply. And where's my picture? This is 23. I called it 25 a second ago, but that's a 3. All right, so we'd have a reduction in demand for meals causes a reduction in labor for producing those meals. Reduction in demand for labor from number 2. This is a reduction in supply of labor that leads to an increase in wage. We're looking for wage to fall and quantity to fall, so it's going to be these. What's the problem with number 3? That tends towards a higher wage. All right. Suppose you're an international trade economist and you're hired to analyze trade between Zealand and Anago. You're told the following: the population is the same. Both use only labor to produce 2 goods, apples and coffee. Workers in each country spend 12 hours per day working. Zealand costs cost a worker 3 hours to make a bag of coffee, cost a worker 4 hours to make a barrel of apples. In Antigo, it costs a worker 1 hour to make a bag of coffee, 2 hours to make a barrel of apples. Based on the information, what do we know? All right, first, let me kind of just get our bearings. It costs Antigo's workers 1 hour per coffee, 4 hours per apples. Remember, these are times. This is the time cost. That's why I said it cost, because sometimes if I give you the comparative, or if I give you this data framed in terms of time, sometimes people make a mistake, try to go directly to a production possibilities frontier, or think of these as outputs. No. To be able to get the outputs, we have to know how much time available they have. So this is just their time expenditure. So 1 hour per coffee, well, there's 12 hours available, which means in Antigo, they can produce 6 coffees or 3 apples, because it costs them 4 hours per apple. Or 2 coffee or 1 apple, or 1 coffee or 1/2 apple. For Zealand, it's 3 hours per 1 coffee, 4 hours per 1 apple. In 12 hours, that's 4 coffees they could make, or 3 apples. So it's 1 coffee or 3/4 apples, 4/3 coffee or 1 apples. So we look for the lowest cost of producing coffee. Lowest opportunity cost is 1/2 apple versus 3/4 apples. So Antigo has a comparative advantage in coffee. Zealand has a comparative advantage in apples. All right, so Antigo has a comparative advantage in coffee. Zealand has a comparative advantage in apples. And let's see, the opportunity cost of apple production is greater than in Zealand. Opportunity cost of apple production. So in Zealand, we make, wait, how am I reading this? Is greater than Antigo. Opportunity cost of apple production. Let's see. So in Antigo, to make 1 apple, it's going to cost 2 coffee. In Zealand, to make 1 apple, it's going to cost 4/3 coffee. Yeah, the opportunity cost of apple production in Antigo is 2 versus 4/3, which is like 1.3. So the opportunity cost of apple production in Antigo is greater than in Zealand. Let's see. If they specialize in trade according to comparative advantage, Zealand should specialize in production of coffee. Oh, we said Zealand should specialize in apples. Antigo's a comparative advantage in production of apples. Antigo's comparative advantage was in coffee. Let's see. Zealand has a comparative advantage in both. No, you can't have a comparative advantage in both, right? You can have an absolute advantage in both. You can't have a comparative advantage in both. Okay. All right. Lastly, suppose we observe an increase in the wages and a decrease in unemployment in the automobile industry. Which of the following would explain this outcome? A recession reduces demand for new cars, and wages in the airline manufacturing industry decrease. So this is actually a little bit more complicated than I drew in my graph. As I'm realizing now, the recession reduces the demand for cars, and therefore reduces the labor demand for workers in the automobile industry. This one right here, I actually forgot to acknowledge this part in what I'll show you in a second. Wages in the aircraft manufacturing industry decrease. That's going to increase the labor supply in the automobile industry. Right? So if wages are lower in the aircraft manufacturing industry, we're expecting those workers to want to work in auto production instead. And that's going to lead to an increase in labor supply. All right, but what are we looking for though? We want to see an increase in wages. A decrease in labor demand and an increase in labor supply are both recipes for a fall in wages. So it can't be A. The cost of capital used in the production of automobiles increases, and the scale effect dominates the substitution effect. This means like it's more expensive to automate, but the scale effect is stronger than the substitution effect, meaning we have less automation, but this also means we hire less workers overall, because the scale effect is like where technology is a complement for labor. And so this will lead to a reduction in labor demand. That's actually going to lead to a decrease in wages, so it's not B. Automobile firms adopt a new production technique that increases the marginal productivity of its workers. Oh, this will increase labor demand. Remember, marginal productivity is relevant for assigning wages. We're assuming we care about the marginal productivity, and we care about the market price, and that together jointly gives us our marginal revenue product, which would be equal to the wage of the last hired worker. So this is a leftward shift of the labor demand? No, because that's also going to give us a decrease in wages. So without even reading C, I know that's correct. The Xbox One and PlayStation 4 hit the market, causing a significant increase in the value placed on leisure amongst automobile manufacturing workers. Yeah, this is going to increase the opportunity cost of working. This will lead to a decrease in labor supply. A decrease in labor supply tends towards a higher wage and a decrease in quantity. And that's this picture here. So A was like a decrease in wage. I guess I was a little bit late. I should have drawn this as a leftward shift of labor demand and a rightward shift of labor supply. That's what I should draw here. For B, that was a decrease in quantity, decrease in wage due to a leftward shift in labor demand. For C, yeah, we get a leftward shift in labor supply, and that's going to tend towards an increase in wage and a decrease in quantity. And then for D, this gave us an increase in labor demand, which is a higher wage and higher quantity, which is not what we were looking for. Okay, more time. We'll go back to the very top to show us this right here, and then I'm going to go and change that one where I had bolded the wrong thing. But anyhow, I hope you enjoy the video. I don't know. Hope you like it, and I'll see you next time.